So welcome to this this program on institutional corruption, about the lab that we had run at the Center for Ethics for 6 years. I'm Larry Lessig, and I'm really incredibly happy to be able to welcome this panel. The panel is a perfect snapshot of what I conceived of when I thought about the lab for institutional corruption. Because we have an investigative journalist, we have a professor of management, we have a law professor, and we have me. I don't know what I am anymore, but these together express the idea of the project, which was to bring together an incredibly diverse group and to develop a language within which we could communicate with each other and begin to explain something or learn something from the world. The mix that we have today are among the favorite projects that we had over these last 6 years, so I'm incredibly eager to listen. I'll have you rely on the excellent summaries in the program for the background, but I'm going to begin by inviting Brooke Williams, who is an investigative journalist, and I just learned right now has become a professor at BU, who will be teaching this fall, beginning with a new course in investigative journalism. So Brooke Williams.
Thank you, Larry. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all, and thanks for coming. So this started in what I often do in investigative journalism, in taking the anecdotal and looking at the systemic, which relates a lot to institutional corruption in terms of systemic flaws in systems that erode public trust, right, in those institutions. And what I chose to look at as a part of my fellowship were think tanks. So nonprofit public policy organizations registered as charities under the IRS code, many of them in the Beltway, who are really almost a part of the government and a part of the influence machine. So they work with lobbyists, the scholars at think tanks, to really create, tailor public policy, as well as become a part of the public discourse that's happening around many of these policies that are happening in Congress that are affecting our day-to-day lives. So think tanks are a very important part of that process. What we knew anecdotally was that think tanks such as the Brookings Institution were accepting money from corporations, foreign governments, individuals, foundations, and we knew anecdotally that there were some cases, going back to big tobacco, in which corporations were trying to influence the outcome of these scholarly papers, right? But nobody had looked systemically at this. You know, how much, how often, what did it look like when they were communicating, for instance, with big tobacco? Were they buying research papers? Like, did that happen? And how much? I'm going to start because Senator Warren certainly describes this very well. This is a video that we ultimately produced as a part of my work at the Ethics Lab. So I'll go ahead and play this now and then continue. Skip the ad.
If a corporation wants to influence what we're doing here in the United States Senate, and they want to do it through lobbying, they have to register. And all of that has to be disclosed, and who their lobbyists are have to be disclosed. So when they come in here, you know this is a corporation that's advancing its own economic interests. Buyer beware. But what the corporations, some of them are doing, is they're taking a bank shot at that. So they take a lot of money, because they got plenty of money to spend. They put it into a think tank with a few strings attached. And the think tank comes up with the research that just so happens to advance the interests of the corporation. And then someone from the think tank takes it to the United States Senate and hands it around. What's really happened is the corporation has both hidden what it is doing and It has bought the glossy name of independence of that think tank. My view is that this is thinly disguised lobbying, but lobbying nonetheless. Doing it under the other umbrella, under the pretense that this is independent research, that's what makes it so dangerous. That then means, right here in the Senate, we can make bad decisions that may favor a corporation, a particular one that paid for it, but not decisions that favor the American people.
So, as you can see, the stakes are high, right? And the patina of academic independence.
The commercial will not be given.
I appreciate your humor. Okay. Okay, so the patina of academic independence, and in some cases, I mean, to be sure, there are so many think tanks, hundreds and hundreds of think tanks just in the Beltway, and almost all of the scholars at these think tanks go in with the right reasons. They go in wanting to do policy research that's going to help people, okay? So that said, I decided to build a database to look at this systematically, okay? And what I had were annual reports, and in this case you can see, 1 million and above. The first is anonymous, and then what is it, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million, we don't know. Okay, so these are think tanks disclosing who their donors are. So I had that data to work with, and created a database with it. And then I realized, I was sitting in the office at the Ethics Center. It was late, and I realized I needed a way to figure out how they were communicating. So I knew, that Qatar, the UAE, Norway were giving, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to think tanks. But I didn't know how they were communicating. And because I can't request public records from think tanks, I had to sort of think strategically and what should I do? So I remember just staring at my wall in the office at the Ethics Center and seeing the top 3 donors, foreign government donors to think tanks, and one of them was Norway. And it dawned on me, wait a second, I can get Norway's records. I think I could do this. And so right then and there, I typed in just a Google search, Norway public records, and it was like the Amazon of public records. It was. You literally would check boxes and put it in a basket, and you didn't have to tell them who you were, just an email address, and you'd get the records 2 days later. So I tweeted this out, not realizing how big it was at the time. Okay, so this is what it looked like. And what I got were very specific contract documents, okay? So I got emails and also, budgets. I started using that information and looking at our own, it's called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So foreign governments have to disclose when they hire people to influence public policy or opinion in the US. And I started to see that they were actually disclosing this as an outside service in these forums. So they were considering it lobbying in some cases. What's so funny is in Norway, somebody who saw all of my thousands of records requests, I stayed up all night, I was just so excited. He emailed me the next day, he said, it looks like you're really interested in think tanks. There's this classified report. I declassified it for you and I thought that you might like to have it. And so this was this report, and I wrote a blog for the lab, and essentially it sort of spelled out how Norway saw its donations to think tanks. And that is, if we give more money, we'll get more access to policymakers. And this is problematic because of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. If the think tanks aren't disclosing themselves as lobbyists, the Department of Justice opened an investigation. I believe it's ongoing. So there were a few gems. There were some invitations, so they would invite people to these the summits where they would get together key policymakers with scholars and and the donors in particular. So like ExxonMobil, Shell were very interested in this. And so they're sending this to the minister in Norway saying, please come to our summit. And then he says no, and they write back, but wait. We're actually going to have this private session with our U.S. Secretary of Energy. Would you like to come now? And they did. They ended up going. So we were able to see that. There was also in Qatar, Brookings Doha Center, in which they talk about independent policy analysis, but it turned out through these records that I received that it was actually completely paid for by Qatar. And there was this press release that they later took off the website that said, the center will assume its role in reflecting this bright image of Qatar, especially in the American media, right? So there were agreements like this that I was able to get that showed that the Azerbaijan considered its think tank agreement as a way to help validate policy decisions, right? What we ended up creating looked like a hairball, and let's see if this causes problems. Okay, so when I first saw it, so this is straight from the database I created at the lab, and I said, boy, I can't even tell what's going on. It's just like a hairball, but then I realized that's sort of what we're talking about. Look at all these countries, right? So this is all over the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, right? And they're giving to many different think tanks. And so we ended up writing the story, and it was a part of a package that won the Pulitzer Prize, which was really exciting for us. Now, I also wanted to look at corporations, as I mentioned, and so I used the same data, and I also used, I reverse engineered foundations filings that they give to the IRS. So they're called 990s. And what they do is, so corporate foundations, so the ExxonMobil Foundation, they need to disclose where they're giving money, okay? They don't have to say where they're getting it from. And so using optical character recognition technology, I OCR'd hundreds of thousands of these documents in order to see where they're giving money to. And that enabled me to create a database of corporations giving money to think tanks without relying on their own disclosures, which, as you saw, 1 million and above, doesn't tell us all that much. And from there, we were able to write 2 more stories in the New York Times, all front-page stories. One about corporate influence. One of our anecdotes in this story involved this man, Mr. Kofi Bonner, who he's standing in San Francisco, and this was a military base, and they were rebuilding it, and they actually had hired Brookings to help promote this project because there was a toxic waste on the site, and there was a lot of public outrage in San Francisco, and they needed help with PR, and documents that I received showed that they actually had hired Brookings to promote this project and to help with the public image of the London Art Corporation that was building there. And this man, at the same time, they appointed him to be a fellow, a scholar at Brookings. So while he's working for Lennar Corporation, who's building on this site, and he's hired Brookings to help them with this toxic waste problem, he's also a scholar there. This is one of the documents that I came to possess, and it was really clear. So in this case, it was a whistleblower that provided documents rather than obtaining them from Norway that sort of gave us a window into what was happening. Okay, and lastly, we took a look, and I'll mention I did this all in collaboration with Eric Lipton and with some help from Nick Confessori at the New York Times. We took the database of federal lobbyists and we matched it up, so linked it up with the names of all the scholars at think tanks And then we took it from there. We realized, not everyone's a registered lobbyist who's doing some lobbying. So we looked at consultants. And so we actually spent a lot of time downloading the names of all the consultants we could find in DC. And we checked them all, and it turned out there were a lot of consultants. And we wrote the third story in the series called Think Tank Sync. One of the the most interesting anecdotes was the Center for Strategic and International Studies was hosting a forum on Toronto airport screening. It was very specific. They were just talking about making screening be more efficient and faster, and the airport authority had been lobbying heavily on this. Well, on the stage was a CSIS fellow, so a scholarly fellow, who also happened to be a lobbyist. Nobody in the room knew this. Next to him is the director of the Toronto Airports Authority, who's his own client, paying him, okay? And you're at a think tank event, so everyone in the audience is thinking, okay, I'm listening to a CSIS scholar interview the Toronto Airport Authority about this new screening process. Well, he was actually just interviewing his own lobbying client in front of everybody under the pretense of being a CSIS scholar. It was in the CSIS building. And Eric Lipton, my colleague, approached him after this and said, "What's going on? This is your client." And he said, "This is what we do. This is just normal." And, "Well, can we have some more examples?" "Sure." Started naming them. So it came together, and yeah, that's about it. So I feel like we knew anecdotally it was happening, and now we know that it's happening systemically. Now we know it's happening at many, if not all think tanks within the Beltway, certainly to some extent. And now lawmakers and others can start to address the problem with facts and understanding the true extent of the problem rather than just anecdotes here and there. And that's all thanks to the lab. Without the lab, that would not have been possible. Thank you very much.
That's great. So next, we're going to have Sunita Sah, who is a professor at Cornell in the management school. And then after Chris speaks, we're going to have a panel discussion where we'll pull all of this together. So Sunita.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Sunita Sah from Cornell. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about some of the research that I began as a fellow of the Safra Center. And this wouldn't be possible if it hadn't been partially funded by the Safra Center, so I'm very grateful for that. So I want to talk about conflict of interest disclosure, particularly in the context of advisors and advisees. And all of us seek advice, especially for the important decisions in our lives. We consult and we rely on advisors such as doctors, lawyers, financial advisors. And one of the problems with the quality of advice is when these advisors have conflicts of interest, in that what's good for them is not so good for us. And one of the main ways to manage such conflicts is to have the advisors tell us about them, so they disclose them. And over the last 8 years, I've really looked at this question of whether disclosure solves the problem of conflicts of interest. I've looked at the effect of disclosure on advisees and how they react to it, and also the effect of disclosure on advisors. And today I want to focus on this aspect. What is the effect of disclosing a conflict of interest? Does it change the advisor's behavior in any way? So just to step back a little bit, there's many different types of conflicts of interest. The kind that I'm particularly interested in is when there's a potential clash between professional interests and personal interests. And we see that throughout society. So in medicine, you get some sponsorship from the pharmaceutical industry. The fee-for-service model in the US also presents a conflict of interest. Financial services, you've got financial advisors that, based on commission, paid on commission, and of course the credit rating agencies that were hired and fired by the same firms whose bonds they were evaluating. So is disclosure a solution to conflicts of interest? Well, it's certainly very widespread across many different industries and sectors and professions. In fact, virtually across all these different industries, virtually all policies that deal with conflicts of interest include, or sometimes even limited to, disclosure. So disclosure has become really popular. Why is that? Well, at least in theory, it provides potentially useful information. So it decreases that information gap between the advisor and the advisee so that the advisee can hopefully make an informed choice. So what would they do with that information? If you've been told that your advisor has a conflict of interest, it alerts you to, there's some uncertainty as to the quality of advice. What do I do about that? Well, perhaps I want to discount the advice a little bit now that I know about the conflict of interest. Maybe I want to shift to an unconflicted advisor. So it's attractive because it really appeals to principles such as transparency or free markets. We like the fact that we want transparency and we desire it. It's also really, in some ways, attractive to advisors, in some ways not. But it involves minimal disruption, so nothing has to change. You can carry on doing what you were doing, you just have to disclose the conflict of interest. And it could relieve you of any feelings of guilt or personal responsibility or even professional liability once you've disclosed your conflict of interest. So could it affect the advisor's behavior? Well, perhaps if you have to disclose, advisors might give better quality advice. They know that people are going to look at it. It might remind them that they're supposed to put the client or the patient, the advisee, first. So they might practice strategic restraint, rein in any bias in their advice, and give better quality advice. And it maybe could become a deterrent to accepting the conflict of interest in the first place. So it's perceived to work for these many different reasons. And I'm going to ask whether it does and the situations in which it can work well. So for advisees can make more informed decisions. So very quickly before we move on to advisors, I'll show you some of the reasons why it might not work so well for advisees. Often, we don't know what to do with conflict of interest disclosure, so we just end up ignoring it. I don't know how to react to that. And if we do react and discount, we often discount insufficiently or it's just erratic. There's just a large variance in how we react to conflict of interest disclosure. We don't know what we're supposed to do with it. We often don't seek second opinions for a variety of reasons. There's cost and time. You want to stay with your primary advisor. You don't want to insult your primary advisor. And even if you report decreased trust, which arguably could be the intended purpose, the advice quality might still be high, so you could end up ignoring valuable advice. Or even if the advice quality is not high and you report decreased trust, you sometimes feel this increased pressure to comply, which is an unintended consequence, that you end up complying with advice more with disclosure than without, even if you don't like the advice. So for all these reasons, I think putting the burden on advisees is probably not the best approach. Asking them to make use of this information hasn't worked very well. So we might want it, but we don't know what to do with it. So what about changing the behavior of advisors? How can we do that? Well, one way is if disclosure becomes a deterrent to accepting the conflict of interest in the first place, so rejecting the gift or compensation from third parties, so you can disclose the absence of any conflicts of interest. So there is some evidence of that. So some prior research that I've done has shown that advisors who have to either accept or reject a conflict of interest, and they know that they're going to have to disclose it the same time that they're accepting or rejecting, tend to reject it so they can disclose the absence of any conflicts of interest. And they report that they do this for ethical reasons, but they are really averse to disclosing conflicts of interest. So in some situations that can work, but there's many situations where it's not possible to avoid a conflict of interest. So many institutions are set up in a way where, for example, the fee-for-service model in the US, which is the predominant form of physician reimbursement, it means that paying physicians to perform a particular test or procedure results in a conflict of interest if the same physician recommends that test or procedure. It's very hard to change that. What happens in those situations? What we would hope is that having to disclose it might remind advisors that they're supposed to put their advisees first and increase the quality of advice. But previous research has shown that when advisors have to disclose, they end up giving more self-interested, more biased advice that harms the advisee. Now, there's a number of reasons why this might happen, but this finding has become pretty important, and it's an important contribution to the literature. And many people are taking this seriously. So all these studies, however, were all conducted in contexts in which money-making was the predominant focus. It was advisors were asked to play the role of a real estate agent or an advisor evaluating the coins in a jar. And in all those situations, giving self-interested advice might be appropriate, you know. There might be other situations, for example, maybe in medicine where people don't think that's appropriate to do. And, but certainly, even though these experimental studies were conducted in these paradigms of where money-making was the dominant focus, other people are generalizing and wondering whether this affects other types of advisors. So the question I wanted to ask is, how does conflict of interest disclosure affect different types of advisors? For example, if you have a real estate agent who is going to get paid more the higher the sales price of a house, and they have to disclose a conflict of interest, would they give an exaggerated estimation? And what about a doctor who could recommend one treatment that compensates the doctor more, but there's another one that costs less and is equally effective? Would having to disclose that cause the doctor to give even more self-interested advice? This is what I wanted to investigate. And what I want to introduce is this idea of this logic of appropriateness perspective, which March documented in 1994, where he spoke about the fact that most people in institutions and organizations don't make decisions just based on anticipation of future consequences, but by asking themselves 3 elementary questions. So first of all, what kind of situation is this? What kind of person or professional am I? And what does a person or professional such as I do in a situation like this? And these questions tend to be, they can be implicit or explicit, but they tend to guide our behavior. It's very much linked with Cialdini's norm focus theory, in that the norms, the injunctive norms around us, what should I do in this situation, really influence our behavior. And Messick actually had a very nice example describing this perspective when he spoke about a vacation that he had taken in Norway. And he was on vacation, and he was taking part in a ping pong tournament. And he was competitive, and he got round to the final round of the tournament. And then he had a look to see who else was playing in the final round, and he looked at the names, and he realized that everybody else that had got round to the final round was a child, aside from him. And it dawned on him that, oh, perhaps this tournament was designed to have a child as a winner. And I'm the only adult that didn't realize this. And as soon as he realized this, there was this all-encompassing shift in meanings and the prescriptions for play, his interpretations of other people's skill. All those things changed suddenly. It was a completely different context. And so I wanted to test what people thought, their implicit norms of different types of situations. Do they think about financial advisors different from medical advisors? So to tap into this, I asked people to imagine 2 different types of situations, a financial situation or a medical situation where they have to give advice. And they have a conflict of interest. So what's good for them is not so good for the recipient. What would they do? Would they give self-interested advice? That would harm the advisee? Do they think it's appropriate to do so? Is this a business decision, or is it an ethical decision? And what we see is that those people think that the financial context is more appropriate to give self-interested advice. They're more willing to do so, and they think it's more appropriate to do so. They also think the same, that it's more of a business decision in the financial context than the medical context. But in the medical context, they think it's more of an ethical decision. So people do view these situations as being quite different from each other. But the question is, what does conflict of interest disclosure signal to the advisors in that situation? Does it make them behave differently? If the disclosure reminds advisors that they're in an professional ethical dilemma, what will they do? So perhaps if you're simulating the role of a real estate agent or a financial advisor and you think it's more appropriate to give self-interested or biased advice in that situation, perhaps disclosure will make you think, yes, it's okay for me to do this. And so I'm going to give even more, I'm going to indulge in my bias even more. Whereas in the medical situation, you might think it's less appropriate. It's less appropriate. We should be putting clients first or patients first. And in that case, disclosure might work and improve the quality of advice. It might make advisors think that they should be reining in their bias and putting their patients first. So I wanted to test this in a series of experiments. So first of all, I wanted to replicate what had been done in the past by using the real estate context, but also randomize people into giving advice in a medical context, and they either have to disclose or not disclose. So this is what we call a 2x2 between subjects design. And so I use the same methodology as has been used in the past. So advisors view a particular house, they view 4 different houses, and they have to give advice on them. They have much more information about the value of the house than advisees. But advisees have to estimate the sales price of the house, and they are rewarded for accuracy. So we're setting up real conflicts of interest here. So advisors have a conflict of interest. They're going to earn more money if they can get the advisee to make a higher estimate. And they either have to disclose their conflict of interest or not disclose it. And what do we see? Well, also, we randomize people into the medical scenario, which is a little bit different, but parallel in 4 key ways. So first of all, we have advisors that have more information than advisees, and they have a conflict of interest. What's good for them is not so good for the advisee. And we look at how self-interested they are in terms of how strongly they recommend the treatment that's better for them rather than for their potential patient. And again, they either have to disclose or not disclose. So here are the results. In the real estate one, we replicate the finding from before. So with disclosure, you get much more increased self-interested and biased advice compared to no disclosure. So we see that finding. But in the medical context, we see the reverse effect. That disclosure is actually reining in bias here. And so we get this interaction effect in which the context is really important when we look at the effects of conflict of interest disclosure on advisors. So in the real estate, disclosure led to more biased advice and advisees were worse off, whereas in the medical one, it worked well. It led to less biased advice and advisees were better off with disclosure. So what is the disclosure actually signaling to advisees? So one of the nice things about lab experiments is that you can really get down to the process and the mechanism. What is going on here? Now, a number of things that have been proposed is, first of all, you get this moral licensing effect with disclosure, that advisors feel less guilt because they've informed the advisee. If that was the case, we'd expect to see that in both contexts, and we don't. What about strategic exaggeration? Well, the advisee is going to discount because I've told them I have a conflict of interest, so I need to exaggerate even more to take account of that. Well, maybe there would be different effects in the medical and the financial context because people might follow advice more in medical contexts. They might discount more in financial contexts. But a third possibility, and one that plays out, is the norm salience. So this is the appropriateness aspect that I'm talking about, is that disclosure prompts advisees to think about the ethical dilemma and then think, what should I do in this situation? What's appropriate for me to do? And if they think giving self-interested biased advice is appropriate, then disclosure will increase bias, and if they don't, they will decrease bias. So I wanted to test that again in more parallel scenarios. So I have people think about, they're either in the role of a financial advisor or a medical advisor, and again, they have to disclose or not disclose. The scenario is exactly the same this time, so we just alter different words depending on the condition that they're in. So they're either taking the role of a doctor or a financial advisor. They're either giving advice to a patient or a client, and it's either on treatment A or B or fund A or B. And then all the payoffs, all the economic decision making is exactly the same in each scenario. And what we see is a similar type of interaction effect. Again, disclosure, when people are playing the role of a financial advisor, increases self-interested or biased advice and decreases it in the medical scenario. And when we ask people how appropriate it is to give self-interested advice in this situation, we find a similar interaction. So it's much more likely when you have to disclose in the medical context that people will say, yes, it's okay for me to do this here. I'm more likely to do it compared to no disclosure. And in the medical one, you see the opposite effect. Disclosure is making people think that I should be putting the patient first. And for those like mediation models, this aspect, this appropriateness of self-interest or norm salience explains the relationship between context and disclosure in giving biased advice. And it's a much better fit than moral licensing or strategic exaggeration. So what are the remaining questions? Would real practicing physicians and financial advisors react in the same way? Well, the medical context is what we call a strong situation. And so I suspect that physicians, medical students, and other types of healthcare professionals would also have the same norm that we anticipate, which is that they should put patients first, and perhaps then disclosure works well. For financial advisors, what are the professional norms? Well, registered investment advisors do have a fiduciary duty to put their clients' interests above their own interests. And last year, President Obama signed an executive order basically requiring retirement investment advisors to put their clients first due to millions that had been lost in poor investment advice. Now, that's been recently reversed. We've yet to see how that works. But perhaps practicing financial advisors have a different perception about their professional norms than we do when we think about the typical, prototypical financial advisor. So real and actual professional norms might diverge, and it's important to sample from those populations. So that's exactly what I did next, was first of all look at practicing medical advisors. So we had medical students who had at least 1 year's direct experience with treating patients and asked them to take part in these similar studies, looking at whether they would give self-interested advice or not. And what we see is, in general, they just give better quality advice. You can see down on the low end, pretty much everyone is giving good quality advice. But still with disclosure, it's better than with non-disclosure. They're still reining in that bias, and it's still helping them improve the quality of advice. And with practicing financial advisors, what do we expect to see? Are they going to increase, as the experimental studies when people simulate the role of financial advisors do? Are they going to increase their bias with disclosure, or are they going to decrease it? And what we find in this sample was, again, they gave good quality advice, and they actually increased the quality of advice with disclosure than without disclosure. So when we sample from real practicing financial advisors, it seems to remind them, and in fact, a lot of them wrote comments about how offended they were that they wouldn't put their clients first, similar to how physicians do. And certainly this sample, who were the alumni of a US university that took part, seemed to think that their professional norm was to put clients first. And of course, we don't know whether all institutions or organizations have the same professional norms, so it's important to pilot in those particular contexts where we implement disclosure. But what we do is we have evidence that disclosure can have unintended effects on advisors. So in some situations, it can increase bias in advice if we think it's appropriate to do so. And in other situations, it can decrease bias in advice, again, if we think it's inappropriate to do so. And so it's not just transparency and disclosure that's important. The professional norm of how appropriate it is to give self-interested biased advice really plays an important role here. So my statement is that disclosure really works best if you can change the behavior of advisors. It's very difficult to get advisees to respond in the way that we might want them to disclosure. And so if we can focus on the benefits for advisors, so we see that they can reject conflicts of interest in certain situations if they're able to do so and they know that they have to disclose. They're motivated to disclose the absence of any conflicts of interest. And they can rein in bias. They can improve the quality of their advice if the disclosure becomes a reminder that, well, the norm is here that I'm supposed to put the client first. So when we think about policies that change the behavior of advisors, we could nudge them to think of ethical issues and, of course, change cultural norms to place clients first. We could also realign incentives, so we could eliminate the need for disclosure in the first place and just think harder about other solutions to manage conflicts of interest rather than relying on disclosure as the most common one. So some future directions. I'm also looking at why professionals accept conflicts of interest in the first place. So 2 mechanisms here, a sense of entitlement because we think we're worth it, and also this sense of invulnerability that we don't think that we're going to be influenced if we put ourselves in a particular situation. We think we have enough self-control. And so my latest project is looking at self-perceived professionalism and whether that might protect us from bias or whether it makes us place ourselves in situations more often where we accept conflicts of interest and then we can't actually protect ourselves from influence. Next up is Chris, and he's going to be talking about a project that we're doing along with Susanna Rose, where we're looking at real-world disclosures in the Cleveland Clinic. Thank you very much.
No. It seems to be gone here. I had it loaded before.
Okay, it's probably on the laptop then.
So I'm actually going to try to do 2 things in the very limited time. One is to give you this experiment that Sunita nicely previewed for us. And then second, I'd like to share some of my new work on how some of these same dynamics play out in the litigation process, criminal litigation in particular, which builds on a long path of my own research, thinking about how jurors rely on witnesses to reveal the truth of a case. And there are similar conflicts of interest in that domain, both among expert witnesses who I've done a lot of work on, but also among fact witnesses, the person who says, I saw the defendant pull the trigger, or I heard the 2 parties agree to the bribery deal. I put these together, I'll go ahead and say, into a similar, here it is. So PowerPoint should be open as well with the...
Yeah.
Great.
You need a clicker?
If that'd be great, yeah. And so these 2 projects, the first is this randomized field experiment. What I think they have in common is that they both depend on what I call chains of epistemic reliance, where you have a patient depending on a physician who depends on the biomedical science, and those relationships can get distorted by finances in a dynamic of institutional corruption. So this is that chain of reliance where one depends on each of the other. But at each of these stages, physicians or scientists can be influenced by their financial relationships so that the advice they give ends up tracking their commercial interests rather than tracking the underlying reality about whether the drug is safe and effective for this patient with this presentation. So as Sunita explained, physicians we know take money from the drug and device industry. This is on the side of whatever salary or whatever other compensation they receive. They can be consultants. They can receive royalties from a product they invent. They can actually receive kickbacks, which are essentially bribes as well. So we've done some descriptive work supported by the lab with Aaron Kesselheim. We took advantage of a new database created in Massachusetts. And we found, just for example, that nearly 2/3 of urologists in Massachusetts were taking money from industry. Over half of infectious disease specialists, nearly half of cardiologists or orthopedists were taking money from the drug and device industry, again, on top of their other compensation. And these amounts can be quite substantial. For example, the average orthopedist surgeon took nearly $20,000 on top of their regular salary. We've also looked at, Susanna and Aaron and I looked at, what effects do these actually have? And here there's a robust literature that suggests in many different ways, both from lab studies going back 30 years to more observational studies of how physicians change their practice when they buy their own MRI machine. All of a sudden they start doing a lot more MRIs when they buy their own machine, for example. So there's a range of literature. Economists sometimes call this supplier-induced demand. You know, a market's supposed to work when the consumer wants something, but here we have people buying things because your advisor wants you to have it because they have an interest in doing so. I will say that, you know, this is not the domain where we can really do a randomized experiment. So the literature here is inferential as to these effects, and they're really tricky to tease apart causation. So there are a range of policy responses, but we'll be talking about disclosures today, and there are a range of disclosure practices that have really just popped up in the last 15 years or so, legal solutions, including a federal law that's passed as part of the Affordable Care Act called the Sunshine Act, which requires disclosures on a federal database for all physicians, virtually all physicians in the United States. These are mostly indirect. There's been very little effort to actually ensure that the patients really receive this disclosures. Instead, it's about putting the information somewhere and hoping that a reporter will pick it up, for example, and analyze it, or that whatever the story may be, it's not typically directly to patients as such. Although I would argue as a bioethicist, there is this larger residual logic of informed consent and a larger question of, well, what should a patient know in order to meaningfully agree to have someone slice you open and put a device inside you? Is the fact that that person is taking money on the side material to that decision or not? So Sunita already suggested that disclosures can be a lot more complicated than you might have assumed. I'll just be focusing on the effects on the advisee, the effects on the patient. And even here it's ambiguous. It could decrease compliance. If the physician tells you that, you might want a second opinion, you might decline. But there are also reasons, some of which that come from classical economics. For example, if the physician is a consultant or the inventor of the product, maybe that means that physician's a really good expert physician. Sunita's also done some work that she referred to on insinuation anxiety, where declining the advice after receiving the disclosure could be seen as an insult or a harm, and so patients can feel more compliant based on a disclosed. And notably, either of these could be harmful. One of the largest causes of mortality and morbidity is actually patients, for example, failing to take their physician's advice, failing to take medicines after a heart attack, for example. So adherence to physician's advice is actually something we need as well. So we need to be careful the disclosures aren't doing more damage than good. Background literature in the last few years suggests that these disclosures could be quite important to patients. Nearly 3/4 think that their physicians are influenced by it. Over half say, if I had the chance to do so, I would look up what my physician receives. More than half say they would actually be less likely to choose such a physician. These are startling responses, we thought, and so they really motivate the study that we set out to do, which was a field experiment at the Cleveland Clinic. Susanna is leading our sort of ground game there. This is work with Sunita and a lot of people at the clinic as well. And so we actually recruit all the physicians. We try to recruit all the physicians at the Cleveland Clinic that are subject to a new policy requiring them to disclose their financial relationships. Cleveland Clinic is sort of a leader nationwide in managing conflicts of interest. So we were able to exploit the new policy requiring their physicians to do so. But nonetheless, they agreed to allow us to have a randomized control group that didn't actually do the policy yet. So we essentially a randomized rollout of this new policy. So after recruiting those physicians, we start rolling through a time period of their patients. We randomize the patients to receive one of several different versions of a disclosure letter. We can pull all their demographics and whether they show up to their appointments from the clinic's calendaring system and electronic health record system. Then after the patients have their appointment, we then try, with their physician, we try to reach them and survey them and pay them to respond. And we get nearly 900 doing so. And then we're also surveying the physicians both before and after to see if they're changing their own disclosure practices in a way that could confound. We also have a whole second qualitative paper about their experiences and their perspectives on this. So this is essentially a 2x2 design plus a control letter. So the control letter, we wanted everyone to get something. So this just reminds them of their appointment, where to park, etc. And then we divide the remainder of the group into 4 different versions. They would either receive a disclosure, these would all get a financial relationships disclosure, but some would be told about the risks of these financial relationships, that they can bias physician prescribing. Others would be told about the benefits that it can serve innovation and keep these physicians on the cutting edge of health sciences. And so by systematically manipulating both of those variables on or off, we get all 4 conditions. And so just quickly to show you, this is the letter that we used. All of them had that appointment reminder. Some of them had, they all had, those outside the control group had this disclosure saying that your physician takes more than $20,000 a year. There's a risk manipulation, as I explained, a benefit manipulation. This is the version that has all of them in them. And the second page, we actually list the companies, what products they make. Because if you think about how a patient is supposed to use this information, they need to know not just that he takes money, but who he takes money from or who she takes money from. And not only that, which products does that potentially implicate? What should I be on alert for if I do want to use this information? And so this was actually a way we're trying to make it more user-friendly and practical. We have a diverse response of the people that go to the Cleveland Clinic. I'll just flag this point is that on the baseline we have a huge degree of confidence. These patients are at the Cleveland Clinic. It's, people come from all over the country referred there for high-end treatments, and they feel very strongly and very positively about the clinic. There's a particular setting we're doing the experiment in that I'll return to. So we also, part of ours just has a survey that we ask everybody in all the groups, and we find that nearly half say, I would want to receive this information about financial relationships. But we also found that only 2% had ever actually gone to look up the information, which is on the federal website that I told you. So this response suggests why a mailing may be appropriate. It may actually satisfy the informational desire in a way that actually gets it to the patient without relying on them to go find some federal website they may not even know exists. And that website is not very user-friendly, by the way. So now these are our first experimental results between subjects design. In our control group, only 2% recalled ever getting a letter disclosing that the physician had COI, conflicts of interest, because they didn't receive a letter. So that's a little tiny false positive. The ones in the treatment group did, in a much more significant way, remember getting it, which was nice. And this is the real informational effect. Did they even know their physician had a COI? 9% in the control group guessed correctly that he did or she did, whereas in the treatment group we have a much more significant number. That's a huge, that's a huge effect to find in a field experiment. Disclosures worked, at least in imparting the relevant information. But of course, 57% is 43% away from 100 that we would like to get. We would like to succeed in getting all our patients to understand this fact. What's the gap? Well, not everyone reads their mail, not everyone understands their mail, not everyone remembers their mail, so there could be that explains part of the problems. We find no difference between the treatment or control group and whether they actually show up at their appointment. You could imagine our disclosure letter, especially that includes the risk information. Watch out, this can bias physician decisions. They might go, oh, well, I'm going to cancel or skip my appointment. I'll get another physician. Thanks for letting me know. We saw none of that happen. The patients did not seem to react differently. We also, this is our main dependent variable is trust, your trust in your physician. And Mayer and some prior research has decomposed trust into 3 components of ability, benevolence, and integrity. I won't go into them in depth because the big finding is that there's nothing there. It didn't actually make any difference on these multidimensional measures of trust, whether the patient received the disclosure, whether they received our risk information, whether they received our benefit information, a big null result. And we tried to beat this up in lots of different ways to see if there's some result that's correlated with something or if there's a subgroup or something, and we really haven't found much there. So we asked, and this is one of these examples. The one reason you do randomized studies is because people are known to not really always be aware of what's impacting their behavior. But in this context, they actually could just tell us, no, that's not going to matter to me. 2/3 says, disclosure information is not important to my healthcare decision making, even though they previously said they wanted it. Virtually none of them said it affected their opinion of their physician. So we've also, again, looked at different subgroups and tried to focus on only new patients, and we worried about if maybe there was a confound with the physician disclosures. We've adjusted for response bias and see nothing there. I'll mention the limitations here is this one academic center, of course. It's great that it is a field experiment with real patients, but they're also a little weird. We don't know if this result would hold up if we did it at a local community hospital. Of course, at a local community hospital, they don't have as many financial conflicts of interest at this level as Cleveland Clinic physicians. And some other things we can talk about, including, this is just one way to disclose. Maybe, if it was provided in a different way at a different time, it could have made a difference. So that's our bottom line, is that the disclosure letter seems to work to inform patients, or at least 57% of them, but it doesn't seem to make much difference to them, even though there are very large financial relationships. And even though we highlighted the risks, it didn't seem to matter. So let's talk more, maybe in Q&A. At least here, disclosure seems to be harmless to patients. If it's working to improve advisor advice, for example, or advisor behavior, then maybe disclosure is a workable solution. But you wonder whether it's really solving the conflict of interest, and that's going to depend on more research on behavior, on the advisor behaviors. And you might also ask whether, for the philosophers in the room, is there an intrinsic value to the patient knowing this information, even if it doesn't affect their trust or their behavior? So the Greenwald Foundation funded this, and this was really incubated during our time at the Safra Center. So let me try to share just a little more research on another topic. And I think it's analytically somewhat similar, because you have this same chain of epistemic reliance. But here it's a juror in a criminal case depending on a witness to reveal the truth. And even an example of such a case, this is Don Siegelman, the former governor of Alabama. He went to prison on a theory that a CEO of a company contributed a bunch of money to an independent political advocacy organization that Siegelman liked, that he liked what that advocacy organization was doing. And so the thought is that's actually a bribe in exchange for putting this CEO on a state board. And so you had this classic quid pro quo agreement alleged, except the only problem was Siegelman didn't personally receive the money, nor did the money go into his own campaign funds or anything. It just served a political interest of his. And so this is a fairly aggressive prosecution by the FBI, and they recruited the governor's, one of his chief assistants named Nick Bailey. And there was later a whistleblower explaining how hard they pressed Nick Bailey to ultimately testify that one thing was given in exchange for the other, making it a quid pro quo bribe. Siegelman was convicted, and he actually went to prison. And so the question is whether the incentives given to that witness, Nick Bailey, which the jury relied on as the key piece of evidence, actually distorted the testimony. And I give you this example, but I want you to understand that this is an extremely common practice. Virtually every trial in federal courts involves incentivized witnesses, and it's very common in state courts as well. Prosecutors can not only offer immunity, but in some cases they've actually given $1 million in cash to a witness. And what's amazing is they can actually make the payments contingent. They can say, if you say what we want you to say, you get the payment. You get the leniency. If you say anything else, then you go to prison. And they can do it overtly and explicitly, and often they have to do it overtly or explicitly in order to get that deal. So in some ways, this is actually more like classic corruption if prosecutors are literally buying testimony. But I actually think it has more in common with our concepts of institutional corruption, because the prosecutors are generally acting in good faith. They're generally trying to get the bad guy, and they're generally trying to overcome other resistance to telling the truth. The courts have recognized there's a general statute that prohibits bribery of witnesses, of course. And it says whoever pays a thing of value to influence the testimony commits the crime of bribery. But the courts have said that, in fact, prosecutors aren't whoever. Prosecutors are not persons subject to the law, so they're able to bribe when it would otherwise be illegal. There's also rules of professional conduct for attorneys, by the way, which explicitly prohibit this sort of thing, but they've been held to not apply to prosecutors either. And it really goes back to tradition, back to the days of kings and dukes having this prerogative. And the courts have more or less recognized that, we've been this way a long time. Here again, though, disclosure is our current solution. There's a key case called Brady and some other laws that basically the notion is if we tell the juror that the testimony was bought, the juror can discount appropriately, just like a patient can discount if they find out their physician is taking money on the side. And so it really makes the juror into this role of an epistemologist. If the truth is causing the testimony, the fact that the X really did shot Y is what's causing the witness to say X shot Y, then that testimony has probative value. But if the testimony is instead caused by the money, then it's kind of irrelevant. It's just telling us he said this because he was paid to say this. Just like you see an actor on TV can be paid to say one thing or the other. And so here's our little contribution is to think analytically about the counterfactual. What would the witness have said if not for the payment? And what I have here is a long list of other tools that prosecutors have. For example, a prosecutor can literally put a guy in jail until he testifies for fear that he might run away instead of testifying. Or another example, you can, of course, threaten a perjury prosecution. Or if someone takes the fifth, you can give them use immunity. So ultimately, what you can force a witness to do is to come to the stand and say, under oath, I don't know, or I don't recall, or he's not guilty. But of course, the prosecutor doesn't want to do that, so the prosecutor adds an incentive that actually flips the substantive testimony. I'm just giving you the outlines of the argument, but the suggestion is that the causal impact on the testimony is actually the incentive itself. So I argue in the paper that a jury should infer that the witness did in fact change their testimony because of the payment. Because of course a rational prosecutor wouldn't have paid that if it wasn't necessary to get the benefit. We go into a little bit of the negotiation theory there. But it also infers that the witness was able to persuade the prosecutor that he would say the opposite, or she would say the opposite, but for the payment. But all this doesn't really tell us whether the testimony is true. It's possible that if prosecutors are only giving these incentives in the right cases, then maybe it all turns out great. It's also possible that the witnesses have a sort of asymmetric ethics here, that they would only lie to exculpate, but they wouldn't lie to inculpate. And then ultimately, we suggest this is probably an experimental, empirical question. And I'll just give you one example of a study. We've done several of these studies. I'm going to skip forward, but one of them is one neat thing about lab studies, you can actually manipulate the truth. You can manipulate whether the defendant is guilty or not. You can manipulate whether an incentive is offered to a witness or not. So we recruit some people to be randomized into either the role of a witness or the role of a juror in the same case that we based on Siegelman, which I already told you about. And we randomize to whether the witness receives an incentive or is instead given a benefit to testify regardless of what he says. So there's no incentive for him to say what the government wants. And we stipulate that in this case, the witness, we tell the witness that in this case, what the government wants you to say is not true. You explicitly don't have the information the government wants, but the only way to get the incentive in the incentive condition is to say what the government wants. So what we find is the incentive makes a dramatic increase in the jurors and the witnesses willing to testify falsely. Some proportion of jurors of witnesses in our situation were willing to testify falsely anyway. I mean, you want to help out the government. The government might have the right guy. You know, this prosecutor's an authority figure. You don't want to, there's several theories for why that might be. But the incentive makes a huge difference. But disappointingly, we find over here when we're looking at the jurors deciding the same case, the difference between not having a witness in the Siegelman case, for example, was essential that someone heard the quid pro quo. Without the witness, you get few convictions. When you bring in a witness, it dramatically increases the conviction rate. But the jurors don't seem to be discounting for the huge incentive, the huge effect of the incentive, which we see over here on the witness behavior. Again, suggesting that the disclosure system isn't working to neutralize the bias we've documented here. We have bias here, but lack of disclosure being effective there. Okay, so in the paper I developed two different solutions. We can exclude these witnesses altogether. There's a more creative method that would allow prosecutors to give, to incentivize testimony without influencing its context. And I'm going to close there. Sorry to rush through all that, but I wanted to give you a flavor of both studies.
Great. So you guys come up. So that was a lot, and I have just a few brief questions, and then we'll try to open it up for questions from the audience. And so I want to start with Brooke. One thing that's striking about this dynamic of giving to think tanks in order to influence congresspeople is that it depends on there being some kind of illusion that obviously Elizabeth Warren doesn't have. But I wonder, is there some way to measure? Do you have some sense of the extent of the illusion? Or who is the group that needs to be fooled? Is it the members, or is it the public who says, you did that because Brookings said it was a good idea, and so therefore you're exonerated for what otherwise would look like a bad decision?
I think it's staffers. So perhaps not the member of Congress. That would be most important, but their key legislative, directors and aides, the ones who are, the think tank scholar goes with the white paper and says, you look at what this study shows. It's typically to someone,
So these are all kids, basically, because nobody stays in that position for long anymore because it doesn't pay anything. So, but do we have any independent estimate of whether they recognize that this is going on, or?
So, in my reporting anecdotally, they were, so in the example I gave with the CSIS, we talked to people and nobody knew. That was just completely shocking. And there were quite a few people from the executive branch and other people in the room who did not know. They didn't realize. They truly thought it was someone from a think tank interviewing an expert in airport policy, and they were taking notes and going to make decisions about it, perhaps bringing it back to the member of Congress, and they did not know. I think that there is the sense now, after the articles, I think knowledge has increased within the Beltway, at least. It depends on the member of Congress, honestly. And some members turn to partisan organizations, and they expect, if they go to Heritage, they're going to get one thing. If they go to, Center for American Progress, they're going to get another. But they're not thinking, am I getting something else?
So we don't know of any attempt to even just survey these aides or people who work on Capitol Hill to see whether they have any sense of the financial interest that might be involved.
Not in a systematic way. For these stories, we interviewed them, and I can't think of one person who knew.
Oh.
Yeah.
Except Elizabeth Warren.
Right. So we didn't interview members of Congress, to be sure. These were, the people who were actually interacting with the scholars of the think tanks. Very often, a scholar of the think tank is not going to make it to the member of Congress. Yeah. It's, that's not going to happen. But the staffers and people, the administration, who were taking these papers and using them to help make decisions, they did not know in our interviewing.
Okay, great. Sunita, so one thing really interesting and powerful about what you've described is that you could imagine reversing the test to determine whether, in fact, there is a professional norm in the particular context in which you're doing it. If you assume that if there's a professional norm, it will decrease the disclosure effect, then just test in different contexts and see whether there's decrease in the effect, and then you see that there's a norm. But it also raises the question of how plastic these norms are. You could say among Wall Street or financial brokerage people that we're going to create a norm that you need to think about the interest of your clients. And you can imagine, all those guys just giggling around the lunch table. Yeah, right. We're going to think about the interest of clients, because it's a context in which people just don't think that's what the game is about, as opposed to, in the context of medical training, because of the way you're trained in medicine, you could more likely construct or reinforce a norm like that. And so I wonder whether this work depends on developing some sense about the plasticity or constructibility of these norms, and if there's some way to even measure or get an indirect appreciation of the capacity to do that.
in the lab, for sure, norms can be manipulated. It's been done many times before. In the field, I think it is a little bit more difficult, as you said. A lot comes in terms of the training and the culture of the environment, which makes it very difficult to at least change cultural norms. So the fact that in this particular sample of financial advisors, their behavior demonstrated that clients should come first, I thought was at least encouraging that a disclosure doesn't have a uniformly negative effect, and that there are situations in which it can work well, and delving into whether people perceive the norm to be okay to harm the advisee at your own self-interest is the key element. So I do suspect that in general fields, and I think it's going to change by institution, not all financial advisors will be the same. Not all organizations will be the same. That's where we need to focus the effort to see how plastic those norms are, whether it can be changed. Norms are very, very difficult in the field to change, especially what we call injunctive norms, like what should I do in this situation, rather than what is everybody else doing.
But what was striking about that experiment where you had real financial advisors and you tried to test whether there would be that kind of effect is because you were not a financial advisor, because you were in some sense, the public, they could be more sensitive to revealing the truth to you than they would be if they were just behaving, right? They were trying to demonstrate, you should trust us. But in fact, if you weren't observing them, there wouldn't have been that kind of effect, right?
Right. That's certainly true. There could have been some element of motivated reasoning on financial advisors that they wanted to demonstrate that the clients come first, but at least that reveals some aspect that that's what they think they should do, right? So at least it's not extremely transparent. That is fine for me to give self-interested advice. That's what my culture is about. So I think we can say, okay, our perceptions of financial advisors are that they're going to indulge in bias and at the expense of the advisee, but at least some financial advisors do not think that's what they should do.
Either that they should do or that it would pay to do, right? So if you can imagine the financial advisor believing that if you believed the financial advisor was really just going to be benefiting him or herself, you would be less likely to invest in his or her fund, right? So it's not so much that he or she thinks they should, as they think, should for some moral sense, as they just think it's not efficacious for them to bias in this particular way, right? I mean,
because they think the recipient's going to realize.
Yeah, and change the behavior. Like you're not going to invest in this kind of fund, right?
Functioning market there.
Yeah, it's a marketing.
So there is that. I think there is that I think applies more to whether they accept or reject it, right? So if they're going to reject a conflict of interest and disclose they don't have any, it could definitely be because they see a knock-on effect that I want you to come back to me and I want to have more business and I want to have this reputational aspect. In this particular, the results in this particular experiment, I don't think speak to that because they were giving good quality advice in both the non-disclosure and disclosure. It's just that they were giving better advice in the disclosure, and that might be difficult for the advisee to really determine.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay, Chris. So I want to pass the first paper and go to the second paper. First, I have to confess, I was completely ignorant about this practice. It's a little embarrassing, but it's astonishing that you have witnesses that are paid by the government. And then the really more astonishing was that you didn't see some effect in the juror's judgment about the witness. And I wonder whether there's a way to unpack why there wouldn't have been an effect. Is it because the witness just generally credits the good faith of the prosecutor, that the prosecutor isn't going to be paying a witness to flip from, to construct a truth that otherwise isn't there? Or is it they just didn't even understand precisely what payment here meant? Because I think if you start from a presumption, which I had, that you would never allow payments in a witness system, it would take a lot of explaining to get people to recognize, no, we are really giving this guy cash in exchange for this guy saying X as opposed to Y.
And just to be clear, I'm bundling here anything that could be a thing of value along with cash. So sometimes it's cash, but other times it's something really more profound, which is years of liberty is what you get, but only if you'll say what the government wants you to say. So that's part of the contribution. There are some interesting background social science research that sheds some light. There's something called the fundamental attribution error, for example, that people tend to overestimate the effects of character on our behavior and underestimate the effects of situation on our behavior. And so the fact that you received a payment is a situation. There's also a coherence form of reasoning where the jurors are really looking for a solution to the problem of this case. They're presented with a highly ambiguous situation, and here's testimony that connects it up, that solves it in a sense for them. And so because that testimony comes with an asterisk that says, but it was purchased, the asterisk can be less powerful than the substantive testimony, which is the key that unlocks. So all that said is this research is kind of in its infancy. All the research on eyewitness behavior up to this point has really focused on memory, which are huge problems also, is that when you have a gun in your face, it's hard to pay attention to who's holding the gun and other things like that. We've actually done very little research. It's amazing, really, considering how common this is, about how incentives cause changes of behavior and how jurors respond to it.
And so
Instead, we're just relying on a milquetoast instruction. Yeah. Jurors are always told to, when evaluating the demeanor, evaluate a witness by considering among other things, their incentives.
Do we know even how frequently it happens?
Yeah, it's in virtually every federal case,
Wow.
and anecdotally, it's just a routine tool. You, in any case,
No, but I mean cash. I don't mean like.
Oh, the cash? No, I don't have any system. Do you think that's peculiar? Is cash a special case? In my view, I haven't really focused on it as particularly interesting. It's just part of the quid package.
Right, but I would think that there's a real difference between. I mean, I agree with you. Like years in jail is probably the most significant. I would think some of these others might be differentially significant, but at least the cash would be the easiest to quantify. I mean, it must be that the government has to reveal how much they're spending in this context, right?
So they do disclose most of this, but sometimes it's also things that are harder to count. Like in big federal crimes, there's often money on the table, asset forfeiture, for example. The government can seize the car, the getaway car, but only if they want to. So the fact that they didn't pursue asset forfeiture could be part of the deal. There's also, I mean, I've seen this in my own practice. There's threats against, well, your daughter could technically be considered an accomplice to this. We're thinking about maybe going after her too. Oh, are you going to be helpful? We really have a heavy workload. I don't know if we'll have a chance. So everything's on the table, and some of these are existential in their threat. But I don't have a statistic for how often cash. I think it is an outlier.
Yeah. Well, so when we started the lab and the idea of this lab for institutional corruption, this is exactly the thing I dreamed of most. Not so much, I mean, I was excited about the work that would happen when we had a lab, but this is 2 years later, and we have continuing work by really great researchers collaborating, even though you're not in the same place, producing powerful, really valuable stuff for the understanding of the way these incentives matter. So I'm grateful to you. We have time for just a couple questions, maybe. Dan, do you have a mic?
Is it working? Okay, on your second study. My understanding of how, if there's an endemic pattern of corruption in an industry, a prosecutor will go after a low-level person who they can skewer, and then mention that maybe they can make this go away if they're willing to inform on the people above them, and so on, until they finally work their way to the top, and then they've got all this damaging testimony. And of course, every step of the way, the way you're doing it is you're coming down like a ton of bricks on a low-level person until they're willing to to talk. So if this were seen as a corrupt practice, because that's this is under the banner of corruption, right? Then it would be impossible to get rid of corruption, because the way you investigate corruption is by bludgeoning the low-level people who you can do that to until they're willing to squeal. So the more general point is that there are a lot of reasons why people would not want to tell the truth in a courtroom, because they might be in fear of being beaten up, or their relatives killed, or who knows what, or just alienating their friends and colleagues of many years, and being kicked out of the clan, And so you give the goodies until the balance shifts, so they decide, well, maybe it's worth it after all. Now, my question is, I know you know all that, so the question is, why do you regard this as corruption instead of, this is, if you want to prosecute wrongdoing, corruption included, especially corruption at the highest level. This is what you have to do, because this is the lay of the land. People have very strong disincentives to squeal and to tell the truth. And so unless you do these things, you're not going to get there. So why would you call this stuff corrupt?
So, I mean, it can be both corrupt and a solution to corruption. Well, it is quid pro quo bribery if you're looking analytically at each step. And this is why I use the Siegelman case as my example, because it presents exactly this irony that you're pressing on. And it's why I didn't have time to talk about the solutions. You have to be really careful about how you craft the solutions so you don't do more damage than good. It's why it's a big law paper rather than just a social science paper, because designing the solution is almost as tricky as identifying the problem. So I want to really acknowledge all of that, but say that doesn't really make the epistemological problem any easier, because we still need to know whether the fact the witness said X is reason to believe X is true.
Let's go to the heart of it. I've always wondered why Siegelman was sent to jail. We've been watching what's happened in Alabama politics just recently. What a circus, right? Now, there were people who wanted to get Siegelman out of the governor's mansion, and they got him. What you revealed here, I didn't know about these huge payments, and it sounds as flimsy as hell. But if was this corrupt? Was there collusion with some Republican faction that wanted him out? If so, the FBI must have been involved. Was this indicative of high-level corruption on the part of the FBI? Now, this is the kind of institutional corruption question that this whole project is about, as opposed to the use of counter incentives to get someone to squeal who otherwise has every reason not to.
Wait,
There's
I
another
just
piece of the
I want to just
story.
make sure we understand what the conflict is. All that you're saying is, if I pay you a certain amount of money in exchange for you lying, will we call that corruption? And you're calling it corruption, right? That's a corruption. And why are you opposed to calling that corruption? It's not systematic, it's not institutional, it's the plain old fashion.
All right, so first of all, Chris isn't just talking about paying someone if they'll lie. It's paying someone if they'll say a certain thing, and that may be true, and you may believe that it's true. So, but Chris is just as willing to call that corrupt as
No, I didn't.
when you pay somebody who will lie to get the money.
Typically, another point to emphasize is that I think we should assume the prosecutors are always acting in good faith. It really simplifies the argument a little bit. The problem is the prosecutors don't know either. The value of that witness is high in exactly the cases where we don't have enough other evidence to convict. So I think that's an important clarification. The other second piece is this has an ancient tradition behind it. But in the last 30 years, we now have a lot of other sources of evidence, actually. We have emails, we have tweets, we have GPS locators, we have fingerprints, we have DNA. It may actually be that the costs of eliminating this practice are lower now than they were 100 years ago. It's really an empirical question and kind of in the weeds.
But that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking about why you call this a corrupt practice. Within the context of what we're all here for, which is its institutional corruption.
Is it corrupt when it's true? When you believe it's truthful?
Well, we sure would call it, if a defense attorney, corrupt. We would call it corrupt, and he'd go to prison. The defense attorney would go to prison if he bribed someone to tell the truth.
But it's
and so generally, similarly,
let's
if I
get some
bribe a
other-
congressman to vote the right way on climate change.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some other questions. Elizabeth? We have a mic right here.
Thank you all. Thank you all. This was really fabulous. I had a question for Brooke, and it actually it follows really nicely from what Chris just said about how things have changed over the last 30 years. So I wondered, did you get any sense of whether the norms of think tanks have changed over time? I mean, is this a phenomenon that is as old as think tanks are? In which case, basically, you know, there's a huge systematic question about think tanks. Or is it that there's been a kind of creeping in of big money into think tanks that, you know, raises these very important questions that you've raised?
It's a great question. So first, with the reduction of government money, so in the past, think tanks relied a lot on government grants. And with the reduction in the availability of that money, as well as large philanthropic foundations that aren't corporate foundations, have also been reining in their money. At the same time, they have been wanting the money that they give, and this includes corporate foundations, to go to a specific project with specific outcomes. And in the past, when the money was more plentiful, they would give money to the general fund, and then people at the think tank would distribute it. The scholars might not even know who is paying for their project. But right now what's happening, and this has occurred over the last 15 years or so, is that the donors want to be involved. And in many cases, they actually, I mean, JP Morgan had an executive with a desk inside Brookings. So they want to be involved. They want to hear what's happening, and they want to fund specific projects. So that has changed. Now that said, you know, during the time, it was about 4 years or so to all these 3 stories to come out. Now during those 4 years, as we were asking questions and as we were publishing, almost all of the think tanks executives said, we're going to take a step back. We're going to look at these practices, right? Now, there was some pushback. As an investigative reporter, it always happens. But ultimately, the think tanks, Brookings and others, really took it quite seriously and said that they were going to look at their practices and see how they might be able to remove the scholars from the money. You know, so some of the documents we had showed that, like, you know, so-and-so corporation was actually paying the actual salary of the scholar. So certain practices like that, they were red flagging as potential things to change. Yeah.
Is there a question for Sunita? Yes. Okay, right over here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was all incredible, all the talks that you all gave, and thank you so much. The question is directly for Sunita, but actually and also connect Chris a little bit to the question. So I'm wondering, Sunita, you looked, if I remember correctly, at when you looked at the real professionals into people who are still in schools. And I'm wondering if you think that there might be an interaction such that the more you are into the profession, the higher your degree is, you'll get less of the effect. And I have 2 reasons to suggest this hypothesis. The first is habituation. There is research in psychology, for example, by Tali Sharot, that suggests that the brain adapts in a way such that you get less of amygdala response the more someone is involved in transgressions, moral transgressions. And the second reason is related to what Chris presented us, not shockingly and not shockingly at the same time, that people are actually almost indifferent to disclosures. Clients or patients are indifferent, and I'm wondering if you are way deep into practicing medicine or selling houses or anything else, you learn that people become indifferent to disclosure, and then you just start to do it and you don't think about it anymore.
Yeah, they're great questions. So to clarify, when we looked at the medical advisors, most of them were students, but we did have a range of experience. And there was a correlation, so the more experienced they were, the less likely they were to give self-interested or biased advice. So the quality of the advice did improve with the number of years of clinical experience the medical advisors had. Now, the financial advisors weren't students. They were alumni of a university. We managed to get a database, and those people that were still practicing as financial advisors, I basically emailed them, and we had about like a 35%, 40% response rate in completing the study. So there were a mixture. About approximately half of them were registered investment advisors, the others were brokers or investment representatives. There was no correlation between the years that they had been practicing and the quality of advice. No, that's the difference. There's still a lot more to be done on that aspect. So yeah, there were no gender effects as well, in case people are interested in that.
So we have time for one more. It has to be the best question. Who has the best question? I think you have the best question right there. Yeah.
So combining Sunita and Chris, it seemed that in Sunita's case, the assumption, I had an image of disclosure that was a personal act by me, like directly to a patient or something. These letters, I find it very hard, I'm a psychologist, to see how a letter is going to have any sustained effect on the advisor, on me as a professional. And so it seems that we have to be very careful if that's right, to think about what the forms of disclosure are that are going to maximally arouse professional role obligations, which that seems to be a way to almost get, just like informed consent in research, which often goes through such processes and informed consent forms that the researcher is far removed from thinking about it. It's often a low-level job done by someone in the lab, and et cetera. And so it would not have that effect, it would seem.
Just imagine Sunita will have something to say also, but in just practicality, time is very scarce in the clinic, and so you can imagine if it even takes 1 minute out of a 10-minute encounter to talk about your disclosures, that could actually be costly. Second is they're harder to control in that domain too. What would the physician actually say? How would the physician spin it? Would you get the risk disclosure and the et cetera? So for research purposes, this was practical, but I think it's also practical in a clinical way as well. But I think Sunita could shed light on in-person disclosures.
I think it's a really important point, right? So especially with the studies that I was presenting, the disclosures are salient to the advisors. And to the extent that we adhere to norms in the environment depends on how salient that norm is and whether it's the norm that's top of the mind. And in a lot of cases, also related to the previous question, is that if these disclosures become routine, we don't know whether it's going to affect advisors' behavior in that way. So the lab studies are fantastic in terms of determining psychological processes and things, but then we need to pilot in the field. I think collecting all the evidence together from different sources, we need to pilot in the field to see what the effect is and what the ongoing effect is.
There's a great New Yorker cartoon of a physician whose lab coat is covered with the logos like a race car driver's is. So that'd be another way to do it personally.
One of the lessons I take is that we have to explore alternatives to disclosure. I think disclosure's been the easy way, and the research on biomedical research and pharmaceutical company funding hasn't shown a major disclosure effect on how that affects the research, for example. I think it's everyone's easy way. It's simply we'll just disclose, and I think some of your research, including the juror research, that ain't the answer. That may be a small part of the answer, but we have to go beyond that.
Okay, please join me in thanking these researchers.